Today, I'm thrilled that we get to sit down with three members of our 2021 National Book Award honored family, Martín Espada, Katie Kitamura, and Natasha Wimmer, to talk about the borders of language, place, and literature. You'll be able to purchase copies of their books and have them signed thanks to our bookseller, the Center for Fiction, and the book signing and selling will take place in the room back there right after the reading. I'm delighted to introduce you to our guests. Martín Espada has published more than 20 books as a poet, editor, essayist, and translator. His latest book of poems is Floaters, winner of the 2021 National Book Award and a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. He is the editor of What Saves Us, Poems of Empathy and Outrage in the Age of Trump. He has received a Ruth Lilly Poetry Prize, the Shelley Memorial Award, the Robert Creeley Award, an Academy of American Poets Fellowship, the Penn Revson Fellowship, a Letras Boricuas Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. The Republic of Poetry was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. His book of essays and poems, Zapata's Disciple, was banned in Tucson as part of the Mexican-American Studies program outlawed by the state of Arizona. A former tenant lawyer in Greater Boston, Espada is a professor of English at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Katie Kitamura's most recent novel is Intimacies, one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2021 and one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2021. It was longlisted for the National Book Award and the Penn Faulkner Award and was a finalist for the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. Her third novel, A Separation, was a finalist for the Premio Vondra Risori and a New York Times notable book. She is also the author of Gone to the Forest and The Long Shot, both finalists for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award. Her work has been translated into 21 languages and is being adapted for film and television. A recipient of fellowships from Lannan, Santa Magdalena, and the Jan McClaskey Foundations, Katie has written for publications including the New York Times Book Review, the New York Times, The Guardian, Granta, Bomb, Triple Canopy, and Freeze. She teaches in the creative writing program at NYU. And Natasha Wimmer is the translator of 9 books by Roberto Bolaño, including The Savage Detectives and 2666. Her most recent translations are Nona Fernandez's The Twilight Zone and Space Invaders, and Sudden Death by Alvaro Enrique. She lives in Brooklyn with her husband and 2 children. We'll begin with a brief reading by each of our authors and then dive into questions. And we'll hear alphabetically from Martín, then Katie, and then Natasha.
Buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes.
Much better. Oh, thank you all so much for being here. I want to give my thanks to the National Book Foundation, to Ruth Dickey, to Natalie Green, also to Katie Kitamura and Natasha Wimmer for being with me here this afternoon. And what an afternoon it is. Given the rain and the wind and the hurricanes in Puerto Rico, in Florida, and the Carolinas, I want to read this poem from Floaters. It's about Hurricane Maria, and we just marked the 5th anniversary of that hurricane. And it's about my father's birthplace up in the mountains, a place called Utuado, Puerto Rico. This poem is called Letter to My Father, October 2017. You once said, my reward for this life will be 1,000 pounds of dirt shoveled in my face. You were wrong. You are 7 pounds of ashes in a box, a Puerto Rican flag wrapped around you next to a red brick from the house in Utuado where you were born, all crammed together on my bookshelf. You taught me there is no God, no life after this life, so I know you're not watching me type this letter over my shoulder. When I was a boy, you were God. I watched from the 7th floor of the projects as you walked down into the street to stop a public execution. A big man caught a small man stealing his car, and everyone in Brooklyn heard the car alarm wail of the condemned, "He's killing me!" At a word from you, the executioner's hand slipped from the hair of the thief. The kid was high, was all you said when you came back to us. When I was a boy and you were God, we flew to Puerto Rico. You said, My grandfather was the mayor of Utuado. His name was Buenaventura. That means good fortune. I believed in your grandfather's name. I heard the tree frogs chanting to each other all night. I saw a banana leaf and elephant palm sprouting from the mountain's belly. I gnawed the mango's pit, and the sweet yellow hair stuck between my teeth. I said to you, "You came from another planet. How'd you do it?" You said, "Every morning, just before I woke up, I saw the mountains. Every morning, I see the mountains." And Utuado, 3 sisters, all in their 70s, all bedridden, all Pentecostales, who only left the house for church, lay sleeping on mattresses spread across the floor when the hurricane gutted the mountain the way a butcher slices open a dangled pig, and a rolling wall of mud buried them, leaving the 4th sister to stagger into the street, screaming like an unheeded prophet about the end of the world. And Utuado, a man who cultivated a garden of aguacate and carambola, feeding the avocado and star fruit to his nieces from New York, so the trees in his garden beheaded all at once like the soldiers of a beaten army, and so hanged himself. And Utuado, a welder and a handyman, rigged a pulley with a shopping cart to ferry rice and beans across the river where the bridge collapsed, witnessed the cart swaying about so many hands that raised a sign that told the helicopters, "Campamento los olvidados," Camp of the Forgotten. Los olvidados wait 7 hours in line for a government meal of Skittles and Vienna sausage, or a tarp to cover the bones of a house with no roof as the fungus grows on their skin from sleeping on mattresses drenched with the spit of the hurricane. They drink the brown water, waiting for microscopic monsters in their bellies to visit plagues upon them. A nurse says, "These people are going to have an epidemic. These people are going to die." The president flips rolls of paper towels to a crowd at a church in Guaynabo. Zeus lobbing thunderbolts on the locked ward of his delusions. Down the block, cousin Ricardo, Bernice's boy, says that somebody stole his can of diesel. I heard somebody ask you once if Puerto Rico needed to be free. And you said, 3 pulgadas de sangre en la calle. 3 inches of blood in the street. Now, 3 inches of mud flow through the streets of Utuado, and troops patrol the town as if guarding the vein of copper in the ground, as if a shovel digging graves in the backyard might strike the ore below, as if La Brigada swinging machetes to clear the road might remember the last uprising. I know you are not God. I have the proof. 7 pounds of ashes in a box on my bookshelf. Gods do not die, and yet I want you to be God again. Stride from the crowd to seize the president's arm before another roll of paper towels sails away. Thunder Spanish obscenities in his face. Banish him to a roofless rainstorm in Utuado so he unravels one soaked sheet after another till there is nothing left but his cardboard heart. I promised myself I would stop talking to you, white box of gray grit. You were deaf even before you died. Hear my promise now. I will take you to the mountains where houses lost like ships at sea rise, blue and yellow from the mud. I will open my hands. I will scatter your ashes. En Utuado. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Hello, is this what? There we are. Thank you, Martin. That was really extraordinary, and it's wonderful to hear you read those poems. And it's really a pleasure to be here with some of my favorite thinkers and writers and translators, and thank you so much for all of you to being here. I'm going to read a short excerpt from my book, which is about a simultaneous interpreter who moves to The Hague to take a job working at a war crimes tribunal, which is loosely based on the International Criminal Court. And because of the company I'm keeping, I thought I would read a little bit about interpretation itself. But fluency was merely the foundation for any kind of interpretive work, which demanded extreme precision, and I often thought it was my natural inclination toward the latter, rather than any linguistic aptitude, that made me a good interpreter. That exactitude was even more important in a legal context, and within a week of working at the court, I learned that its vocabulary was both specific and arcane, with official terminology that was set in each language and then closely followed by all the interpreters on the team. This was done for obvious reasons. There are great chasms beneath words, between two or sometimes more languages that could open up without warning. As interpreters, it was our job to throw down planks across these gaps. That navigation, which alongside accuracy required a certain amount of native spontaneity, at times you had to improvise in order to rapidly parse a difficult phrase. You were always working against the clock. That was more significant than you might initially think. With inconsistent interpretation, for example, a reliable witness could appear unreliable, seeming to change his or her testimony with each new interpreter. This in turn could affect the outcome of a trial. The judges were unlikely to know to change of personnel in the interpreter's booth, even if the voice speaking in their ears suddenly became markedly different, switching from male to female, from halting to deliberate. They would only note the change in their perception of the witness. A sliver of unreliability, introducing fractures into the testimony of the witness, those fractures would develop into cracks, which would in turn threaten the witness's entire persona. Every person who took to the stand was projecting an image of one kind or another. Their testimony was heavily coached and shaped by either the defense or the prosecution. They had been brought to the court in order to perform a role. The court was run according to the suspension of disbelief. Every person in the courtroom knew, but also did not know, that there was a great deal of artifice surrounding matters that were nonetheless predicated on authenticity. In the court, what was at stake was nothing less than the suffering of thousands of people, and in suffering there could be no question of pretense. And yet the court was by nature a place of high theatrics. It was not only in the carefully crafted testimony of the victims. The first time I attended a session, I'd been startled. Both the prosecution and the defense had been unmeasured in pleading their cases. And then the accused themselves were often grandiose in character, both imperious and self-pitying. They were politicians and generals, people used to occupying a large stage and hearing the sound of their own voices. The interpreters couldn't entirely eschew these dramatics. It was our job not only to interpret the words the subject was speaking, but also to express or indicate the demeanor, the nuance, and intention behind their words. The first time you listen to an interpreter speaking, the voice might sound cold and precise and completely without inflection, but the longer you listen, the more variation you would hear. If a joke was made, it was the interpreter's job to communicate the humor or attempt at humor. Similarly, when something was said ironically, it was important to indicate that the words were not to be taken at face value. Linguistic accuracy was not enough. Interpretation was a matter of great subtlety, a word of many contexts. For example, it is often said that an actor interprets a role, or a musician a piece of music. There was a certain level of tension that was intrinsic to the court and its activities, a contradiction between the intimate nature of pain and the public arena in which it had to be exhibited. A trial was a complex calculus of performance in which we were all involved and from which none of us could be entirely exempt. It was the job of the interpreter not simply to state or perform, but to repeat the unspeakable. Perhaps that was the real anxiety within the court among the interpreters, the fact that our daily activity hinged on the repeated description, elaboration, and delineation of matters that were outside, generally subject to euphemism and elision. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. Is that picking up? Yeah. such a treat to be here today with Katie and Martín and Ruth. And I'm going to read just a little bit from the very beginning of The Twilight Zone, which is a novel with a protagonist with who bears a lot of similarities to the author, who becomes obsessed with a member of Pinochet's death squads, who became one of the first to tell his story to the public. So this is from the very beginning of the book. I imagine him walking down a city street. A tall man, thin, black hair, bushy mustache. In his left hand is a folded magazine. He grips it tightly, seeming to draw strength from it as he walks. I imagine him in a hurry, smoking a cigarette, glancing nervously from side to side, making sure no one is following him. It's the month of August, specifically the morning of August 27, 1984. I imagine him going into a building at Calle Huérfanos and Bandera, the editorial offices of Cauce magazine. I'm not imagining that part. I read it. The receptionist recognizes him. He's come before with the same request. He needs to talk to the reporter who wrote the article in the magazine he's carrying. I have a hard time imagining the woman at the reception desk. I can't form a clear picture of her, not even her expression as she eyes the nervous man before her. But I'm sure she's wary of him and his urgency. I imagine she tries to put him off, tells him the person he wants isn't here and won't be in all day. There's no point waiting. He should leave and not come back. And I also imagine, because that's my role in this story, a female voice interrupting the scene. A voice I can imagine as I write, if I close my eyes. It's me you want, the voice says. How can I help you? The man studies the woman speaking to him. Probably he knows all about her. He must have seen a picture of her at some point. Maybe he tailed her once, or read her file. She's the person he wants. The one who wrote the article he read and brought with him. He's sure of it. Which is why he approaches her and extends his right hand, offering her his armed forces ID card. I imagine the reporter wasn't expecting anything like this. She looks at the card in bewilderment, and fear, I might add. Andres Antonio Valenzuela Morales, soldier first class, ID number 39432, District of La Ligua. Accompanying this information is a photograph stamped with a registration number 66650. I'm not imagining that part either. I'm reading it right here in a statement later written by the same reporter. I want to tell you about some things I've done, says the man, looking her in the eye. And I imagine his voice shaking slightly as he speaks these words, which aren't imagined. I want to tell you about making people disappear.
Thank you all so much for those beautiful readings. It's so wonderful to hear your words from you all. And I'd love to start. I know that Natasha and Martín, you are both translators, and Katie, your book is about an interpreter, like the passage that you read. And I'd love to start hearing you each talk a bit about what translation means to you. And maybe, Natasha, would you want to start?
Wow, that seems like such an obvious question, but I'm not sure what to say at all. What translation means to me? Well, I guess it's a way for me to participate in bringing the written word to audiences I guess in an intermediary way. That doesn't sound very noble. I love language, and it's a way that I can contribute. And I love trying to make the voice of someone else speak out in a new language. As a translator, I'm very interested in rhythm and in finding that certain cadence that will allow the reader to be carried away by the prose, which is, something that's so easy to lose in the translation process. So I guess that's what I think about a lot as a translator.
That's great. Katie, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm approaching it primarily through the kind of work, when my work is translated. I think it's really a wonderful example of when, as a writer, you write alone a lot, and I think when my book is translated into another language, it's a collaborative project in some way, and I love reading in translation. I always think of it almost as an additive process. I think of it as like another consciousness at work on the manuscript, and for me, it produces a kind of really wonderful effect. So I think sometimes translation can be almost, like even the phrase lost in translation, there's always this idea of it being in some way that something is lacking or something is absent, but I think it's actually the opposite, both in terms of when my own work is translated, certainly, and also when I read in translation, is I feel like there's almost like an abundance of surplus, of things that are being added, and that's very, very exciting to me, and I think, if I aspire to anything kind of style-wise as a writer of fiction in English, it's that I wish it would sound like something that had been translated out of another language into English, because I love the way that it introduces little disjunctions, little gaps. It just kind of makes you understand the flexibility of a language when you're no longer falling back on the kind of standard syntax, for example. Like when you were talking about rhythm, I feel like when I can feel the kind of translator as well as the author producing a rhythm, it's really, really exciting for me as a reader. So I think, when you're writing fiction, you often will have the books that you turn to kind of remind you of what you would like to do or the kind of scope of your ambition. For me, those books are always books in translation.
Oh, that's fascinating. Yeah, thank you for that. Martin, how about you?
Well, I would characterize myself as a recovering translator because it's incredibly difficult to do well. It's extraordinarily difficult to do well. My first experience with translation, aside from sort of growing up hearing, some various combinations of English and Spanish in Brooklyn, was in court. I worked as a tenant lawyer. I was a supervisor of a program called Su Clínica Legal, a legal services program for low-income Spanish-speaking tenants in Chelsea, Massachusetts. And my clients came from the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, of course, Puerto Rico and the DR, but increasingly were coming from Central America, Salvador and Guatemala. They were refugees of war. They were fleeing Ronald Reagan's wars in the late 1980s and into the early 90s. And so the interpreters were routinely assigned to the criminal sessions because the criminal sessions had priority. And that meant the civil sessions, including eviction, would not have interpreters. And so we were pressed into service, suddenly thrown in. And what I associate with translation is this terrible urgency to get it right. It's so important to get it right. It's so necessary. So much hangs in the balance. Whether we're talking about eviction on the one hand, or more broadly, communication between cultures and between societies, and we need more and more. I speak of it as a necessity. The first literary translations I was involved with had to do with a poet who lived in the city, and his name was Clemente Soto Vélez. Clemente Soto Vélez was a Puerto Rican poet. He was a nationalist. He was an independentista. He was a leader of the independence movement who was a political prisoner as a consequence and spent 6 years in federal prison as a result of his advocacy for Puerto Rican independence. He was a major political and cultural figure, and he was completely and utterly untranslated into English. And so I took that on with a friend of mine, Camilo Pérez Bustillo, and we were quickly humbled because, unfortunately, we had chosen to start our careers as literary translators with a surrealist. And so the language kept handing me my head. Here's your head, what's your hurry? So we did it. We did it imperfectly. We did it as a matter of necessity. We did it because it had to be done, because we wanted to make sure that his words would exist in the language that surrounded him in this city before he died. And we did that. And years later, when I wrote an essay about him, I revised all the translations to make them better.
Martin, I'm glad you mentioned your career as a lawyer, because the next question that I had for you specifically was, the book is such a powerful call to action around the immigration crisis, and I wondered how you think about your past as a lawyer and how it shows up in or doesn't show up in your poetry.
Yeah, well, being a lawyer is a lifelong condition. And once your mind is trained that way, it can't be untrained. And so it absolutely directly affects what I do as a poet. I know there are those who don't see the connection. I was constantly getting that, and when I was in the media in Boston, the Boston Globe kept doing stories about me. My God, he's a poet lawyer, like something out of Greek mythology. You know, the head of a lawyer in the body of a poet, or vice versa. But for me, there was a complete and utter consistency. First of all, both as a lawyer and a poet, I think and express myself as an advocate, speaking on behalf of those without an opportunity to be heard. Not that they couldn't speak for themselves given the chance. They don't get the chance. They don't get to be sitting here in front of you in this church, you know, on a rainy and windy Sunday. I'm here. So, yes, advocacy, but also on the level of language. Both lawyers and poets have to be absolutely precise in their language. One word out of place and the whole scaffolding collapses. So I always saw precision, accuracy in language as being a common denominator for both poetry and law.
Oh, I love that. I love that. Natasha, I wanted to ask you some about memory. The narrator in The Twilight Zone sifts through her own memory, her husband's memory, and the idea more generally of the Chilean memories, and questions reliability. And I wonder, what was it like for you to translate that and to think about memory and making that accessible to an audience that might not have had access to the same historical knowledge?
That's an interesting question, and yeah, the novel really does revolve around memory, and also who. And I think that it's not hard for the U.S. reader to follow it, because Nona writes in a very, in a very plain and unvarnished way, and I think she, explains as she goes, and also, she's writing for younger Chileans who didn't live through the period either. I mean, she herself is thinks of herself as, someone who lived through the tail end, or, she was a child when Pinochet came to power and, grew up under Pinochet and then experienced the aftermath of it as a young adult. So that's really her, the tail end of the regime and the aftermath of it are really what belong to her. So when she writes about the past, she's exploring it for herself, kind of as an outsider too. But how she writes about memory, I think she's also questioning what we do with memory and how much we're allowed to assume for ourselves in almost appropriating memories of atrocities. In one part of the novel, she goes to visit the Museum of Memory, which is a relatively new museum in Santiago, which is dedicated to the Pinochet era, and it's this beautiful building. I actually was lucky enough to go and visit it myself with Nona a few years ago, and it's a beautiful building, and it's, you know, she writes about it with sort of mixed emotions. You know, to what extent is, you know, to what extent can memory be, in a way of forgetting in some ways? You know, is it appropriate to memorialize it in this beautiful way when a lot of the, you know, a lot of the crimes have not been, or a lot of the criminals have not been brought to justice, and there's this attempt to just move on without entirely confronting, while at the same time memorializing the crimes. So that tension is at the heart of the novel.
Absolutely. I love the scene where the 7-year-old son is even aware of the irony. This is just so profound. Yeah, thank you for that. Katie, Intimacies also deals with atrocities, and it's such a compelling story that, for me, centers around the power of words and language and the spaces around them. And I know you spoke a little bit about that before, but I'm curious what you see as the power that language holds in this world of The Hague that you've built and bring readers into.
I mean, it was interesting because I think, you know, I did all the usual research things that novelists tend to do. You know, I went to The Hague and I interviewed a number of simultaneous interpreters, which was tremendously useful. But I think one of the things that was the most useful was the fact that the International Criminal Courts makes all of their transcripts available to the public to download. So you can download thousands and thousands of pages of the documents. And a lot of it is in a kind of technical, legal language that is beyond the average person, but there is something really profound about being seeped inside the language of the world you're trying to think about. I think the kind of structure of the institutions comes through to you in a lot of ways just by reading mechanically through the language. So I did a lot of that. I read a lot of transcripts. And I think one of the things that's interesting about The Hague and about the court in particular is this question of you know, the official languages of the court are English and French, and so the official languages are these colonial languages. And so there's this very interesting, even in the designation of official language, it kind of is interesting to question how then are these other languages designated. And this kind of not simply potential gaps between languages as they are interpreted, and there's often a kind of daisy chain of interpretation that takes place as well. It'll be translated from kind of maybe in and out of 2 to 3 languages. But it's also the kind of question of what is prioritized, what is kind of being taken out of its native tongue, what is allowed to remain inside of the kind of primary language. So it became very hard for me to extricate power from the language that I was trying to think about. So constantly in the novel, I think I was really trying to, you know, who's controlling the language, who is unconsciously controlling the language. All those things kind of seeped out of a technical register into a kind of much more deeply psychological register for the characters.
I love the language of seeping, and it's something that I thought about in reading both Intimacies and The Twilight Zone, the way that the teller of a story becomes affected by the story that they are telling. And I'd love to hear from both of you, how did writing these books and telling these stories affect you?
Do you want to go? I mean, there's one that was particularly difficult, which is this. I mean, I always knew that the kind of novel centers on a figure that is loosely based on Laurent Gbagbo, who's the former president of Côte d'Ivoire, and I knew that I didn't want this figure to tell the story of what took place, and I knew if there was going to be somebody speaking that narrative, I wanted it to be from a victim's perspective. And so I really combed through all the transcripts and I read a lot of the trials, and then I just had to try to give voice to that character as truthfully as I could. That was difficult. It felt like there were a lot of ethical questions around doing that I think were much more of concern to me than any kind of psychological issue for me as a writer, or emotional issue. But it was just trying to figure out what is the best way of doing this in a way that feels ethical and that does not feel like it is appropriating somebody else's story, and that it is also representing that story.
Well, I'll preface my answer by saying that I recently read Katie's novel, and so much of it, really resonated with me. But one bit that really struck me was at one point, the interpreter says that, in the process of interpreting, sometimes you don't even grasp the content of what you're interpreting. You become so involved in the language. And obviously that's not entirely the case for a translator as opposed to an interpreter who has the luxury of sitting at the desk and obviously knows what's happening in the story. But there is a little bit of that. And I will say that I think that for me, what I'm mostly thinking about when I'm translating, and particularly when I was translating Nona, was how I think the hardest thing about translating this book was really Nona's voice, which is this very interesting kind of colloquial and domestic voice, but also journalistic at the same time, and getting the warmth of it, but also the detachment of it at the same time was difficult. And it's a very Chilean voice too, and a lot of that is lost. But that's what I found myself thinking about.
Martina, I'd love to hear you talk about the same kind of question, but I was thinking about the titular poem, Floaters, and it's such a beautiful poem, such a devastating poem, and how, for you, that poetry of witness evolves and what it's like to write it.
Yeah, just for those who may not be aware, the title poem, Floaters, is about two Salvadoran migrants, father and daughter, who came to be known by their first names as Oscar and Valeria, who drowned crossing the Rio Grande in June of 2019. A photograph of their bodies went viral. I'm sure most of you saw it. It was everywhere, on television, and the headlines, and the internet. And it provoked outrage, it provoked grief, but it also provoked what we now call trutherism, skepticism. There was a post in the I'm 1015 Border Patrol Facebook group charging that this photograph was a fake, that was doctored, right? The libs were at it again. And so I was reacting to both the photograph and that post. Some poems start life as an argument. Most famous example I can think of is Wilfred Owen, who wrote a poem called Dulce decorum est, which comes from the longer phrase Dulce decorum est pro patria amore, from the poet Horace, how sweet and decorous it is to die for one's country. And so he had this argument with Horace, but also with a poet of the time in England named Jesse Pope, who wrote pro-patriotic doggerel. So he had an argument with Horace, but also with Jesse Pope, and we ended up with one of the great anti-war poems of the English language. In the case of Floaters, I had an argument with that post. I had an argument with, it's not just that post, but that whole mentality. It comes from Alex Jones. It comes from InfoWars. It comes from this notion of fake news. That particular right-wing canard, which now embraces the fiction that Donald Trump won the last election. So I was wrestling with that particular kraken as well. So the poem has the momentum of an argument. Now, I'm not only responding emotionally, I'm responding as an advocate, as an attorney who represented Salvadoran migrants as they fled war, Reagan's wars. I'm also responding as someone with a background as a journalist. And so I did quite a bit of research as well. And of course there was coverage in English, but the coverage in Spanish went much deeper. And so while in English there was a focus on the drowning itself, in Spanish you could read about the funeral. You could read about the burial. You could read all kinds of details about their personal lives before this tragedy happened. And so I delved into that. And I wish I could leave that poem in 2019. I wish I could leave that poem where I found it 3 years ago. I cannot. Right? You know it's happening. You know it's happening as we speak. You know it's happening despite the fact the Republicans are out of the White House and the Democrats are in. We still have Title 42. We still have a disaster at the border, and we are trying our best to pretend that it isn't happening.
Yeah, it's a powerful poem and a powerful point. Thank you for that. Okay, now I get to ask each of you some things I'm just curious about. So I'm curious, Natasha, I know this is the second book of Nona's that you've translated. How was it the same or different to do book number 2?
Well, the two books are very closely related. The first book, Space Invaders, is a shorter book and a sort of more thoroughly fictional retelling, I guess, of one of the same stories. There's a little bit toward the end of the Twilight Zone about an incident that the narrator, when the narrator was a girl, she was in the same class as another girl called Estrella Gonzalez Jepson. And she would go for rides, and the girl had a chauffeur, and the chauffeur would take her and some friends on rides in the park. And then later, as an adult, she hears stories about a news story, and the same car appears in the story. And Estrella Gonzalez Jepson's father was one of the death squad, Pinochet's death squad leaders, and that car had been used to drive 3 of the last victims of the regime outside of the city where they were executed. So she takes this story and her imaginings about Gonzalez Jepson's life and turns it into the story Space Invaders, and then it also has a smaller bit in the Twilight Zone.
Ah, thank you for that. Now, next on my reading list, now I know. Katie, I'm so fascinated in Intimacies that I feel like you play with intimacy with the reader, and my nerdy craft question for you is, how did you decide when you were creating that character that we're following, like what to include, what to not, and not to name her, and that, like, how did you make all those choices?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I kind of took a gamble on the hoping that there are a lot of different ways for a reader to feel close to a character, and I think we're a little bit conditioned to think that we know a character by knowing their background or what happened to them in their childhood. Obviously, at one extreme is what Parul Sehgal wrote about in The New Yorker in her essay, The Trauma Plot. I mean, I think that's one extreme of how we're taught to read. But I really was hoping that I could make a character where you could come to know the character very intimately simply by seeing how she sees the world and how she reacts to the world around her. So the idea was that it was really point of view would give you everything you needed to know about the character, and that I could withhold really almost everything. I went back and I added a tiny bit of backstory in the first paragraph of the novel, the very first paragraph of the novel, which was almost the last thing that was written in the book. But apart from that, there's very little, including the name, age. Most of that information is withheld, but I hope that the reader would be brought close enough in simply by inhabiting very thoroughly her point of view. And then I also feel that I don't mind a little bit of distance when I read between me and the characters. I don't feel like I need to be the characters inside their head. I don't feel like I need to be their best friend. I definitely don't feel like I need to like them. And I always like to play with that a little bit as well. I think it's interesting to be, when I'm reading, to be with a character, but not necessarily terribly, terribly close to them.
Very fascinating. Thank you. Martín, I love that the cover photo is of your father, and the last poem in the book is to him, and you read a poem also about him. I'd love to hear the story of how did that cover come to be?
How did the cover come to be?
Yeah.
You mean this cover?
Yep.
Well, it's, I believe, the 9th or 10th book I've done using my father's work on the cover. My father, Francisco Luis Espada, Frank Espada, was a community organizer. He was a leader, some would say the leader of the Puerto Rican community in this city in the 1960s. But above all, he was a documentary photographer. And he created something called the Puerto Rican Diaspora Documentary Project, a photo documentary, the Puerto Rican migration. He himself was a migrant. He was born in Puerto Rico and migrated to this country in 1939. And he dedicated his life as an artist to documenting this migration and even the reverse migration back to the island. So in the past, what would happen is I would simply decide I was going to use a photograph and then I would use it. But the publishing industry has become more and more legalistic. And so this time, when I wanted to use this photograph, I actually had to get permission from my mother, who was 91 years old, and didn't take it very seriously. She kept saying, yeah, of course, take it. I said, no, you have to sign something. So we did that. But the reason I chose that particular image is because, I know most of you can't see this, but this is a man named Angel Luis Jimenez. And my father encountered him when my father was working on a photo essay concerning the Puerto Rican mushroom workers in Kennett Square, Pennsylvania. This man had just been evicted from company housing. And he was saying to my father, we come here to experience hunger and bitterness. And his family was behind him. My father would never just, he was not a street photographer in the sense he would just snap you. My father would engage somebody like this in a dialogue as he would as a community organizer. So he would get the whole story, they would establish a relationship, and my father would be snapping photographs. And that's how this came about. And someone like this would say to him, please tell my story, please get these pictures out there so people see it. And so the common denominator here is, once again, migration. My father, who was a migrant, taking a photograph of this migrant who's being evicted for a book called Floaters, the title poem of which is about migrants. And I neglected to mention one more argument, by the way. You may be wondering what the word floaters is all about. That's the word used by members of the Border Patrol to describe those who drown crossing over. So all of that comes together in the choice of a cover photograph for a book like this. I don't know who I'm going to get permission from next time.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I'm just going to forge the documents.
Thank you for sharing that story. I know we're almost at time. I want to give you all one brief minute to, if there is a book that you would like to recommend to our audience, other than yours, which I hope you're all going to go and buy and get signed in the back room. Are there any books that you'd like to recommend, authors you love, or do you want to tell people about a project you're working on next in a rapid-fire way?
I just read a fantastic novel by Lena Wolf, the Swedish writer, called Carnality, which is really, really brilliant and unexpected. And I'm so embarrassed to be blanking on the translator's name. This is the worst possible company for this to be happening. But yeah, I just finished it yesterday. It's extraordinary.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Well, I feel like I should know the translator's name myself so I can help you out, but I don't. I just was reading through the other finalists for the National Book Award Translated Literature Prize, and I liked a lot of them, and I especially loved Winter and Sakcho, the winning choice, which I think really deserved it. And I highly recommend it. It's a really quick read, and it's set in on the border between South and North Korea, in this kind of bleak, hostile during the winter season. And it's about an encounter between a French graphic novelist who's staying there and a Korean young woman who works there, and it's just really beautiful. I highly recommend.
Cool, thank you. All right, Martine.
Yes, if there's one book of poems I recommend these days, it's a book called Contemporary American Poetry by John Murillo. That's contemporary with a K, American with a K, contemporary American poetry. 4-way books. The author is John Murillo, Murillo. He is a self-described Afro-Chicano poet who writes wonderful narrative poems about, among other things, growing up in Los Angeles. And John lives in Brooklyn, but he's never here when I am. And so now I can tell him I said this and embarrass him.
Well, thank you so much for those recommendations. Martine, Katie, Natasha, thank you for your time today. Thank you for your beautiful work in the world.